Welcome to Taking the Tradition On. So we are here every month on the first Tuesday of the month. And each month is a conversation with an artist that inspires me and that I think that you will enjoy as well. Usually my artists are storytellers, but possibly in a wider sense of storytelling. And it's aimed at adults. This is an adult conversation. It's always aimed at adults, but I have to say that tonight we may be going more into adult territory than perhaps we normally do. So there may well be some adult language tonight, and we're also going to be looking at adult issues. So just to give you a little bit of a heads up on that, and we might be going into some quite sensitive areas as well. This wonderful space where we can experiment and explore and go into different spaces is made possible by my fantastic patrons. So thank you all. You know who you are. You are completely marvellous. Cecilia is here tonight. Cecilia is one of my loyal patrons. She's completely fab, as they all are. If you would like to join and become a patron, find out who is, you're also going to be the first to know who's on Taking the Tradition On, and there's a space there for discussion and to talk more about things and just to generally support this space. You would be welcome. Just look for Amy Douglas Storyteller on Patreon. And if you are watching this on demand later on YouTube, please do subscribe, because having a few more subscribers does mean that I get to unlock more things that I can do on YouTube, which is quite helpful. Now, tonight, my guest, I'm very excited about this. My guest is from Trinidad. So from a completely different part of the world to where I'm sat, completely different time zone, but I think on a similar wavelength. So Shivanee Ramlochan is a Trinidadian author, poet and book blogger. She speaks out for minority voices. She is somebody who is candid and strong. She's got a unique voice, and she speaks up for minority voices. She is compelling. She can be controversial, but while she talks about quite contentious issues sometimes, she does it through symbolism, through lyricism, and with use of traditional folklore and fantasy. So I'm hoping that you are going to enjoy her work as much as I do. Please put your virtual hands together and say hello to my marvellous guest, Shivanee Ramlochan. Hooray! Whoop, 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 whoop. Welcome to Taking the Tradition On, Shivanee.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Amy. That's very lovely of you. I'm really happy to be here, sharing the space with you and everyone who is also joining us. I'm truly honored.
Oh, well, so are we to have you here. I have got a huge long raft of questions and things that I would like to talk to you about, because that is the beauty of this space, is we have an hour where we can delve and talk about things that we wouldn't normally do in just casual conversation. But I don't know how many people here have heard you as a poet. And so actually I'd really like you to just start us off with a poem so that we know what we're talking about.
I would be honored to do that. So again, thank you everyone for being here. It's really delightful to share this space with all of you. As Amy has said, my name is Shivanee Ramlochan. I'm a poet from Trinidad and Tobago, which is in the Caribbean. I've published one book of poems, which is called Everyone Knows I Am a Haunting. My publisher is People Tree Press, who are incidentally based in Leeds, and they are the world's foremost publisher of Black, British, and Caribbean writing. And this book was published in 2017, so it's been a little while. But the things that I started writing about then remain very important to me. One of them is abortion rights. So a content note to this poem is about abortion. The abortionist's daughter declares her love. Here is the church. These are the doors that open to the sea. My grandmother once knelt here, awed, a special guest to an exorcism. It is nothing like the movies would have you think, she told me, and I believed her. They have called me many things between these aisles, she told me, and I believed her. That is the trouble with our trade, she said. When men aspire to terrible jobs, we offer them hushed respect, the blushing necks of virgins, women wearing the same gloves, sorting the same straight-backed pins between the prayers of their teeth, are taught to deserve nothing more than an acreage of sorrow. Why an acreage? Never give a woman more sadness than she needs. From this fabric, from this persistent earth, she will wrangle greater things than men can fathom. She will wrestle squalling tar infants from the mire, and those children shall stumble upwards, slicing through the spines of men who have offended their mothers. Give a woman an acreage of humiliation with one spade, one crucifix, one box of straight-backed pins. You've given her nothing she can grow. Within the year, she will run up hard against the borders of her land, shrieking, scouring the air for a way to flee her sex. Give her enough land to hang herself. Here is the church. It lies close to the land that they gave us. Come see the land of my grandmother and her mother and hers. Come walk on the borders of my mother's land where no trees grow.
Oh, thank you. Let that sit there for a moment. So we have met because we are working on a Jubilee project, which is an interesting concept anyway. And the whole thing, I mean, like certainly Britain has been overwhelmed. We've just come out of the Jubilee weekend, a big bank holiday celebrating, commemorating 70 years of the Queen on the throne. And we're going to be working together for the next month throughout June with a group of women from the Commonwealth, a group of women artists. And I think we're going to be commemorating rather than necessarily celebrating, but just exploring the fact that we have had 70 years with a female figurehead on the throne. And I think the whole thing about the Queen is really interesting with the power that she has. And yes, she's this female figurehead, but what power she actually has within that role. And us discussing our cultures, what life has been like for women in that time, and the power that women have. So I just think that poem is a really interesting and thought-provoking and an important place to start. And this is a wonderful journey for me, finding out more about the Commonwealth and the countries that are in the Commonwealth, because I have to admit, I am terribly ignorant. I had to look it up at the beginning of this project just to find out exactly how many countries there are in the Commonwealth. I did know that Trinidad was one of them. So tell us about Trinidad. I don't know how much other people know about Trinidad and what their images are. From my point of view, Trinidad has always been this exotic, exciting, beautiful, sunny place. You know, you've got this wonderful beach behind you, and it is blue sea, sandy beaches, palm trees, and reggae. I mean, that's as much as I really know about Trinidad. I don't know about anybody else. I don't know if anybody else is going to be brave enough to share their kind of stereotypes and the little bits that they know. I was chatting to give you a chance. I think they're all being a bit scared. So tell us what it's really like. Tell us what it's like from your point of view, Shivanee.
I mean, I've always lived in Trinidad. I was born here and I grew up here. My ancestors came from the Indian subcontinent as indentured laborers to replace African slavery. And I mean, generations of Indo-Trinidadians have lived here for a long time. They mostly settled here and in what was then British Guyana, which is now Guyana. Guyana being a Caribbean country on the actual continent of South America. Trinidad is just off the South American coast and is very close to Venezuela as a comparison. I mean, Trinidad and Tobago is perhaps one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse places in the Caribbean, simply because of how many people from how many different parts of the world settled here across the course of our history. Whether that means that there is harmony and a rainbow sort of melting pot is up for debate. I think some people would say yes, and some people would acknowledge the reality is a bit more complex than that. But the relationship between Trinidad and the UK is, of course, pivotal because of the slave trade, because of colonialism, because of Windrush. I mean, those ties are unshakable. Some might say they're steeped in blood, and maybe some parts of them are. But what's also true and really interesting is that in almost every part of the Commonwealth Caribbean you go to, so including Trinidad, but also places besides Trinidad, you'll find that particularly older generations of Caribbean people hold the monarchy in great esteem. I mean, there are some people who think that the Caribbean islands should never have sought autonomy or should not be independent, and that would be better off under the Queen. And I think the reason for that is that it's not always easy to be a young nation. The history of Trinidad could fit into the history of Great Britain many, many times over. And so, in some ways, we're a young place, at least our recorded history is young, but the history that predates that is certainly old and ancient. And for a lot of Trinidadians, that link to what they perceive as the mother country is definitely to England. People think of it in terms of great love and loyalty, but also suspicion and resentment. So it's really a mixed bag. And there is a saying about Trinidadians that you will find this everywhere in the world, that anywhere you turn up, from Alaska to Antarctica to Japan, you'll find Trinis. Generally, the stereotype about us is that we're fun-loving, musical, exuberant people. Of course, we all know there's no such thing as a monolith, but I do think there are things that make us special.
And I would say, I mean, your folklore is part of that. I mean, I do think of Trinidadians being bubbly and an oral people. So whether that's through song or storytelling or poetry, I think of you as people who are willing to stand up and to talk, and who are entertaining and have something to say, and kind of are usually kind of quite up for doing things. Obviously, those are the sort of people from any culture I'm most likely to meet because they are the ones that are around and put themselves forward, maybe. But I think that would be part of my stereotype. And so taking the tradition on has kind of has evolved out of storytelling, and that's our baseline. So I don't think you would call yourself a storyteller, but I think you would definitely know about the storytelling tradition in Trinidad.
It's, the importance of telling stories orally has always been really fundamental to Caribbean people, because I think what's important to remember is that there were times in and before our recorded history where it was not easy, not possible, and not sometimes punishable by extreme measures for either slaves or indentured laborers to record their stories, to preserve their storytelling traditions. And so the method of retaining all of that through speech, sometimes through very subversive ways, has been what's kept so much of our culture alive across generations. Our Trinidad Carnival, which has been called the greatest show on earth, which tells you how proud we are of it, is heavily oral in terms of performance and the dramatic arts, and the spectacle of Carnival is really extraordinary. And alongside that, there's always been a narrative running through it of how people in this country have defied the empire, have made a space for themselves under really difficult conditions, whether it was slavery or post-colonial society in which we now live. The Carnival is seen as a huge act of creative rebellion and inspiration. And telling stories within that is extremely important. And to be honest, truly joyous. And there's stories that, when it comes to our folklore characters, I think every Trinidadian child knows or knows some version of. And what's really exciting is seeing those stories acquire more and more variations and complexities and nuances over time as new generations of storytellers take them up and make them their own.
So I know you use quite a lot of folklore in your poetry work, and are there any particular kind of folklore figures or spirits or beings that you think are maybe particular Trinidadian that we might not know about, or that you just find particularly interesting and exciting and that you like to use them in your work?
So there are 3 poems in my book, Everyone Knows I Am a Haunting, that are about duendes. A duen, which is traditionally spelled Douen, which I spell differently in my book, which I'll explain why in a minute, is an unbaptized spirit that is genderless, so neither male nor female. They were principally used as a cautionary tale to children. For example, a mother might tell her child to be obedient, or the duendes will come out of the forest and take you with them. So duendes wear straw hats that cover their faces, their feet turn backwards. They're usually not clothed in very much, so they're either naked or wearing very, very little straw. And I think they must have been an offshoot of Christian sort of proselytization, which led many people to enter the Roman Catholic faith. And so baptism is kind of central to this element of folklore, because the duen was the result of what happened to you if you weren't baptized as a child. And anyway, these duens live in the forest, and they were said to prey on the unbaptized children and the young children who were pre-baptism, take them into the forest and make them one of their own. So in as much as they were a cautionary story, a scary kind of boogeyman figure in child form to make children behave, they've also always been a source of real fascination for many people, including me. In my book, I spelled duen Duenne, because I was trying to understand things about the duen as a character that I felt weren't really evident, namely, what did duens want? What were their secret desires and fears when you remove that scary, terrifying nighttime element from them? They're creatures of the forest, and forests are sites of great healing, wisdom, and knowledge in Trinidadian culture. what kind of things could they teach us about the forest if they could. And it's not so much that I believe in it, when like I don't think I will ever get to see one, or that one will just show up on my doorstep. It's more having great respect for our folklore. To me means appreciating everything that's come before about it, but also being really willing to interrogate it for my generation and generations to come. It's like, what are we asking of our folklore characters who may have been principally intended to scare us? What can we learn from them beyond that fear? And that's why writing about Edwin was so important to me. And those are still some of my favorite poems in the book, because I feel like, real or not real, I have a kind of emotional relationship with them that runs very deep.
Oh, thank you. They sound amazing, and I think I'm really with you, kind of with folklore. I think that we need folklore more than ever now. It's we kind of in this modern world, and people going about technology, and kind of there's so many fewer unexplored places, that I'm constantly being kind of faced with this challenge of, is folklore really relevant anymore, and old stories, and they're not really useful. And yet I think we've come to, me personally, I think we've come to a point where we desperately need to talk to the planet. There's so many things that need sorting out, and folklore and stories are this continual conversation with the land and the world around us, that we just have this kind of this amazing repertoire and ongoing long conversation of wisdom and connection, that if we're foolish enough to ignore that, which we may be, heaven knows, but it seems like one link that actually is there to really to help us, and there's a lot of information and a lot of things that can guide us and help and inspire and actually tell us where we maybe should be changing things and going. And all of those stories that are coming out about spirits of the forest and spirits of the land, I think, are just more important now than ever. And certainly in Britain, I'm having lots of conversations about gender and trying to change the language of stories. I think there have always been lots of stories with interesting gender within them, and stories have always contained a continuum between male and female and in between. But the ones that have been recorded and written down, a lot of the time, are the ones that were recorded by Victorian collectors, who have definitely given us kind of a biased view and biased slant in the majority of stories that we've got left. So having those stories about kind of genderless spirits and that reflection, I think is really interesting, and I think really helpful, and I think something that's very much reflecting the things that we're looking at in British folklore. And there seems to be this whole lovely range of young storytellers who are coming in, who are they're looking at our folklore and saying, where are the people that represent us, and questioning stories, and that's what Taking the Tradition is all about, is kind of how do we keep the best of our tradition and take it into the future, but also take it on, question it, and have that conversation. And I think it is a wonderful way to have a conversation with our ancestors. Sorry, I sort of slightly went off on one there, Shivanee.
No, I enjoyed hearing that a lot.
And it's an invitation as well. So everybody else, if you want to get involved in this conversation, the chat is here. So feel free to ask questions and put comments in as well. So we've having a few going on there. And Janice, I hope you definitely get to go to the big party at Christmas and get to go to Trinidad. I might come and tag along as well. It sounds like a wonderful thing to do. I will try and keep an eye on the chat all the way through, and we want to bring you into the conversation. And if I do miss anything in the chat on the way through, then we will be having a Q&A at the end. So if you have burning questions that come up, then do put them in there and we will come back to those. I want to come back to women in storytelling and poetry and in Trinidad, because so much, obviously, that's where we're exploring at the moment, is the role of women and our power, soft power and hard power. And you write so much about feminism, and is that because you feel that women don't have enough of a voice at the moment in Trinidad? And are there many women poets and women in storytelling? What is the gender balance in storytelling and narrative culture in Trinidad?
Ooh, that's a huge question, but a great one.
Sorry.
I think, no, it's great. It's great. I think even if we look at just the traditional literary arts of books on a page, the great Trinidadian writers of past generations were all overwhelmingly male, which is not to say that female writers of that time didn't exist. They certainly did, but they definitely weren't anywhere near as celebrated or respected, and maybe didn't have as much of a chance to be published. So now I think when you look at the publishing industry in Trinidad and in the wider Caribbean, the dramatic inverse is true. Women far outnumber men in terms of both independent and larger scale traditional book deals, in books that win huge prizes or are shortlisted for them, books that become regional and international bestsellers. So the paradigm shift has been remarkable. What that is owed to is probably any number of things, but I think it certainly has to do with, well, what we're talking about now, which is women bucking up against tradition. I mean, I have trouble with the idea that women were always subservient and passive and just domestic, like in my grandmother and her mother's generations. I think women have always known, in ways that might not have seemed so apparent, maybe to a younger demographic, how to resist, how to perform private but meaningful insurrections, how to be defiant in ways that would still preserve some element of their safety. And they did so much of this by rebelling in a domestic sphere, as well as in controlling their domestic habitat so convincingly, in performing negotiations that had a lot to do with gender and supplanting that gender, and ruling with a quiet but implacable hand. And I think when we look at storytelling in Trinidad, a lot of that is just as true. There are some stories, for example, related to Carnival. When Carnival time comes around, I know I only want to hear them from a particular storyteller, and 9 times out of 10, it happens to be a woman, which is not to say a man couldn't tell the same story just as well, but it's the resonance of hearing it told by a female storyteller who I respect and venerate, that there's nothing like it. I know I don't have to explain that feeling to you, Amy, because it feels kind of like you are creating your chosen family within your culture. I mean, we all have our blood families with whom we have either fraught or harmonious relationships, or some mixture of the two. But the community of people telling each other stories in the Caribbean is so rich, and it is so feminist. It is so female centric in ways that are just beautiful to me. I was definitely brought up to respect and adore women in some specific ways as people who retain so much of our culture and share it and pass it on, often as really thankless labor, often as what is perceived to be a byproduct of their role and function without getting any kind of credit. But I think my mother who's retired now, but was an English language and literature teacher for all of her professional life, was always very adamant about how important it was to pay attention to the unsung parts of women's labor. So like there might have been evident things that a woman could do to tell a story, to take on a creative role, but I was always taught to look at what was less evident. And I think that kind of instruction has served me very well. So all that to say that it is a great time to be a woman storyteller in the Caribbean. I think we've come a really long way, and it's been hard won, but we did it because the women before us were also brave and resilient. Like they weren't weak and subordinate in any kind of stereotypical way. They were also warriors in their own rights.
That's just so fantastic. I mean, I had wondered how you got into poetry, um, and it just, your mother sounds amazing, and it sounds like you probably
Yeah.
won't remember getting into poetry because it's just been there. It sounds like you've been surrounded by words and
Oh,
women
yeah.
and valued women all of your life. So, um, which is just fantastic, and also the fact that you've embraced that and not rebelled against it, and just kind of that. Your mother must be just delighted.
He is. Yeah, I think sometimes, no, I know sometimes the extremes to which I carry my creative material is, those can be a bit challenging for her, but I mean, bless her beyond words. She's very, very supportive of the kind of writer I need to be and choose to be, even when that takes the work into some really uncomfortable and sometimes dark places.
There's so much coming in on the chat. There's so many brilliant comments here, Shivani. So yes, we've got Simone here, who is I think 3/4 Trinidadian, and yeah, you were saying you find Chinese everywhere. So Simone is my local find. She's my lovely Trini friend from down the road in Clun. Saying the oral tradition is huge in Trinidad. People talk, and Simone is a very fine performer in her own right. Yeah, and lay story and conversation one upon another, and that thing of kind of having to learn to join multiple conversations all at the same time. And it's just like, because there's, yeah, I think, yeah, just everybody wanting to talk and not necessarily all listen at the same time as well. And yeah, unsung parts of women's labour. Sophie, I'm with you on that. It's just a wonderful, compact, beautiful phrase. The unsung parts of women's labour. There's so much to unpack in that. Yeah, and Jane is saying that's so true. Women passing on stories and tradition, even when it skips generation, grand to grandchild, when women have no time, as well as mum to daughter. And I think that is often the way of the grandmother to the granddaughter. I think it's such a crucial relationship, and one that we struggle to hold on to, I think, in Britain a lot. People move around so much. I'm sure this is true for the rest of the world as well. Of it's getting harder to maintain those grandparent relationships that have always been so intrinsic, and the grandparents being the ones that do have that time to educate the children, spend time with them, and tell them the family history. It's great that we have the freedom to move further around, but that is one of the casualties that doesn't always get to happen. I mean, I really felt that in my family, because my family have always been very wordy and very much into poems and storytelling and music and performing, and living that bit further away. I used to be really jealous of all my cousins who would have all this time with my granddad, who was this amazing raconteur. Not only was I the youngest of the grandchildren, but also this distance. But then that maybe also gave me the fire that I wanted it more than the rest did as well. So I could see the benefit of it from a distance. So did you have your grandmother around as well as your mother?
I did. And when we're talking about grandmothers, I have to tell you, grandmothers are very important in my poems as well, which I think happened completely without me planning to do that. That actually happened as a direct response to someone, I won't say who, saying that the age of the grandmother poem was dead, or that it should be, because grandmother poems were so boring and didn't and shouldn't be a part of our current poetry landscape in the Caribbean because they've been done to death. And I'm by nature a very defiant and contrarian person. So when I heard that, I thought, wow, no, that just doesn't make any sense. And it really, I actually have to be grateful for that provocation though, because I think without it, I might not have explored how very important both my grandmothers are, well, to my life, to the poems that I make. One of them is deceased, one of them is still alive. and the one who's alive is actually my only living grandparent, and the one I grew up with. That's my father's mother. And they were both such remarkably different but powerful women. And definitely when I was a stereotypical wayward teenager, there were things about them that I took for granted. Things, like I was just saying, that I thought were weak or coded as inferior or submissive, but that I realize now in my adulthood were formidable acts of strength and of resilience and of like intense creativity. They were both, and they were and are both extraordinarily creative people. And I think what could their lives have also held, in addition to raising so many children and running their households and dealing with the vagaries of husbands who are both good husbands. We know that's variable and also a subject for another time. What would they have done if they had a bit more free time to themselves? What kind of things might they have created? What kind of stories might they have told more for pleasure than out of responsibility? That relationship between my grandmothers and I, and for so many other writers in the Caribbean, I know women writers and writers across the world, is extremely important. Whether or not the relationship was close or fraught or so, like the links between two people in that way, and then your mother or father is in the middle of that bond. It's just, I mean, if I never wrote about anything else in my life and said, okay, from now on, all my poems and essays are going to be about my grandmothers, I wouldn't run out of things to write about. Like, there's what you can get out of paying attention and being devoted to a person's full existence is extraordinary. And I would be privileged to do that kind of work for my grandmothers. The one who's passed away, I mean, I miss her in ways that I couldn't have predicted, but she has also become part of my perpetual story to myself, also in ways I couldn't have predicted. She's with me all the time, and in the stories I tell myself and others, which I think is, I mean, I will always be grateful for that.
So what is, I know this is going to be a really hard question, but if there were just one or two things that are kernels that you've really gained from her that you carry with you, what are they? What is it that made her so special?
So we're talking about my grandmother who passed away, right? So that's my maternal grandmother, my mother's mother. And she's the one I didn't live with, but we would see her pretty often. And she was simultaneously the most unfailingly generous and the most extremely volatile person. So just think about those two extremes.
I know somebody who's very like that.
That I have ever known in my life and probably will ever know. I mean, her generosity was really, really selfless. She would just give anything she had to anyone that she loved, or anyone who was in need, or anyone in front of her who was suffering or unhappy, or you couldn't go to her house and leave unfed. That kind of thing. You couldn't go to her house without any money and not be given some kind of money to subsist on. And she was also like extremely fiery. She was a jealous and possessive person. I think she loved completely intemperately. You know, she was that quality that makes a person a firecracker. That was what she was. And so I think if I learned two of the most important things I learned from her are that there are ways in which you can give yourself in acts of service that will absolutely cost you nothing, but return everything to you. And also the importance of knowing where your own backbone is at all times, will serve you very well.
So amazingly, you've actually just really summed up my mentor, who was Duncan Williamson, who kind of these conversations started with, because
Oh.
he was very like that as well, and just literally kind of, you know, you would take him gifts, and the gift was that he would have then something to give to the next person who came. Like you knew it was that act of passing it on. And he used to say that money's round because it goes around, you know, kind of as soon as you lock up money, that's when you start to have problems with feeding people, with having enough to wear and everything. As long as you keep passing the money on, everybody's fine. It's just when you start kind of saving it all up in piles and it's not being used that you start with having issues, which, you know, I look around the world today and think he had a fair point on lots of those things.
Yeah.
But man, could he hold a grudge? and and he could. I mean, he was a fiery person. Everything revolved around the fire, and absolutely, he just had that spark and that fire in his soul. And I think that's true of so many great storytellers.
Yeah.
Yeah, know your own background. Absolutely. I mean, Duncan. And I think this is something that we grow into with age. And I think that's the other thing about having grandmothers and grandfathers, is that you don't see them when they are young and vulnerable and figuring out who they are.
Yeah.
And so you kind of, you see them when they are formed, when they've been, you know, when they've gone through the tragedies and difficulties of their life and they've figured out who they are. And you get these kind of real elders who absolutely are you know, they walk heavy on the ground. They are there, they have that background, the backbone, they have the fire, and you really kind of can see what you can become as a human being, you know, of all of that possibility and potential to really get to know yourself. And it's one of the things that I love about kind of having spent time with old people who have, and I suppose particularly the generation of both our grandparents. I think that was a particularly hard time to live through. And I don't know how old your grandmothers were, but most of those people all kind of lived through the Second World War and had been really kind of put through all sorts of things, and had come out being made better. I mean, there's also lots of elders that kind of broke and didn't become better, but that way of kind of, it intensifies what you are. And I saw something about kind of just on Facebook today, people talk about, you don't talk about trees growing old, you talk about trees growing. And maybe we should talk about humanity that way of just, I think that we become a really weird society, the way that we look at age, and the way that we assess age and what we can learn from old people, and how to really respect our elders and what we can get from them. And it's not about, I'm getting on one of my soapboxes now, but there's so much kind of pity and old dears and all the rest of it. And it's just like, wow, there's so much that we are cutting ourselves off from by that attitude. I have other questions that I would love to ask you, but then we'll be diving into kind of a whole big new conversation and pool. So people, we are about 3/4 of the way through. So if you have questions that you would like to put on the Q&A, and if you've got directions you want to take this conversation through and ask Shivanee, this is the time to do it before I take us in a whole kind of new slant. Janice, I love that you being, when you are positively rude, you are entertaining and cutting and brilliant. I love you when you're rude. And I think, yes, be rude to people with ageist tendencies. Yeah. And that, yes, becoming old and becoming elder, they are different. They're different things. Absolutely. Not everybody does become an elder. Everybody has the potential, though. Right, let me just click on the Q&A. So, Despina is asking, why are you a haunting?
No one has ever asked me that before, and that is a brilliant question. I love it. I love it. I love it a great deal. So the name of my book is Everyone Knows I'm a Haunting. It's actually a line from one of the poems that happens to be one of the Dwen poems. And so in that poem, the Dwen is speaking, and they're explaining the ways in which they are on the fringes of normal society. but also how much they yearn to feel a sense of connection to what might make them feel whole, and remembering the love that they had. I mean, that particular duenna is talking about the love they had for their sister and their brother, who in the world of the poems have also become duennas separately. And I never planned for that line to be the title of the book. I remember very vividly how it came about. The book was almost done, and but it lacked the title. And I was really trying not to force it, trying to let the poems sit together and live together and breathe as one, and hoping that a name would emerge out of the forest of that. And I was sitting at the dinner table with my partner, and we were probably thinking about the same thing. And then all of a sudden, just that line, "Everyone knows I'm a haunting," came into my head. And I took a scrap of paper and a pen, and I wrote just that line and folded it and passed it to her and said, "What about this?" And her response was so visceral and so full of, I mean, the best way I can describe it is like this bewildered joy just came over her. It was one of the most beautiful and generous things I've ever been given in my life. Seeing how that phrase in isolation could affect someone, even someone who heard it 1,000 times before, who'd been moved by my poems in really specific and intimate ways. And I thought, this is the root energy of what I hope the book will do, that it will speak to people who feel they're on the fringes of a world that doesn't always make space for them, maybe never made space for them, but that even though they haunt those spaces, there is room for them wherever they are in the world, whether they're on the edge of the forest or in the middle of the city or in the center of a graveyard or on the top of a building. That once you own yourself, you also open yourself up to unfathomable connections that hopefully are filled with endless love.
That's so beautiful, Shivanee. Thank you. And do you know, it's interesting because I read that title and I thought that it was probably for an entirely different reason. And I think that's one of the great things about that title, is that it can be interpreted in so many ways. And one of the things that I love about your work is how brave it is. And I think perhaps as a storyteller, that a storyteller and a poet, people have different expectations of you. And I want to do adult work. I'm interested in asking and exploring adult topics. I'm still struggling to create some of those spaces. And one of the things that I have been looking at and thinking about working is there's actually lots of stories and folk songs about domestic abuse and domestic violence. And certainly because it's just an endless thing that's happened through female history. And I mean, male history as well, but much more female history. And it was legal until relatively recently. It was the done thing. That's how you tamed your wife.
Mm-hmm.
People still perform the taming of the shrew, which kind of is one of those plays I really think you could let drop. And so in your work, you really face that head on, and you have a whole series of poems that are about domestic abuse. And when with that whole thing of everyone knows I'm a haunting, that thing of becoming lesser within yourself, of almost haunting your own house and your own body, and your kind of spirit and body becoming detached from each other and the situation until you can get out of it. And I had a whole different perspective on that title. So it's really, really interesting to hear that really beautiful description. And I love it. And I really recommend that you go and read the book if you have chance, people. It's not necessarily a light read, but
No.
it's inspiring and it's challenging and it's reflective and it's something to read when you are awake. and you're ready to be a little bit challenged. And so unless anybody, there's some lovely comments here. We're still talking about elders as well. Just looking at some of these, yeah. Cecilia's saying, I think many people are not allowed to become elders in our society. I think that's true, but I also think that there are certain people that, I mean, they're elders in their own right anyway. It's just that we're not getting the benefit of them. They might be kind of fiercely just going out and gardening and utterly being themselves, but nobody else is getting to do the apprenticeship with them that maybe they should do, and they're not getting the benefit of being with somebody who really knows themselves, who's become settled in their own body and has that weight to pass on to somebody. Simone saying there are structural traditions of elders like women, and men becoming genderless in old age. They become an elder, so earlier gender roles get cast out. There are places where women become elder if they are widowed, and my favourite is my daughter's, who, when our Trinidad grand died, said my mother had become an adult because both her parents had died. So she's translating adult as elder here as well. Absolutely. I mean, this is the thing, is we have rites of passage all the way through our life, and I think becoming an orphan, it's maybe nicer to be an elder than an orphan, but they kind of happen at the same time a lot of the times. They're just it's all those experiences that forge you, that shape who you are.
Yeah, I think
that inner strong self.
That's so true, and it's ironic that we're discussing this now. It's something I think about a lot. My mom, when her mother died, my grandmother was 80, but my grandfather had died when I was 6 months old, of heart complications. And so my mom said, there is truly nothing in the world like the feeling of being parentless. And mom was already approaching 60 at that point, but the age that you are, she said, when both your parents are no longer on the earth, is almost irrelevant, that you will feel it acutely. And both my parents are alive, so I have no basis for understanding what that feels like, but it seems to me that it would involve a very definite kind of sorrow that then opens a door for a really specific kind of remembrance, is what, at least observing my mother and her process with grief, what she went through and is always going through in that way.
Yeah, well, I'm the same. I'm very lucky. I still have both of my parents, and I'm not in any rush to get rid of them at all. You know, but at the same time, I'm not looking. Well, I'm not looking forward to it at all. It's also the right way of things, and that is something that I need to go through, and is always, you know, is kind of the only other option is that I die first, and then that's to lose a child, and it doesn't matter if they're 40 or 50 or how old they are. That is a pain that I wouldn't wish on anybody. You know, it's your parents dying is a terrible grief, but also a necessary burden in your life journey and the right process. If anybody says that to me straight after they've died, I really probably will deck you. But you know, but I'm also very aware of that. You know that is. So I'm probably going to throw you completely now, Shivanee, because I know that you had a poem that you were thinking about finishing with. But have you got a poem of one of your grandmothers that are inspired by one of your grandmothers that you'd like to share? It can be something different if you like, but it would be lovely to hear some of those thoughts and
I do. It's the same poem that we were discussing. So it's very lovely that the conversation led us organically here. So this poem was written during lockdown in 2020. So it's not in the book. It's newer. The Ledbury Poetry Festival commissioned it as part of their pandemic poem series. And when I read it, you will see that obviously it's not, there are elements of magical realism to it, but the relationship involving the central figure and their grandmother, and the act of combing hair is very much based on my own life and growing up with my paternal grandmother, who is my only living grandparent. And I will put the link in the chat so you can see the text if you like. My grandmother plaits my hair at the end of the world. The uses of your hair are different now, my grandmother says, as her hands weave in the black mass. She balances a bone comb between the bounty of her gold teeth. You must use it to survive, not sweeten. From where we sit on the island's balcony, the mask of the world is cracking open. The river of sharp caimans quickens in its silence, widening between our house and all the other homecomings of dread. My grandmother smooths the central part in my scalp, runs red oil down the bared confessional of skin and curl. This is how the whole self becomes a leaf blade for enduring, under the brown hands of the woman who once wrestled you, screaming, into the world of wet silences, into your mother's arms. When my heart knocks hard in its unmasked chamber, I lean into the weaving my grandmother's hands make. She combs in the terror of the small hours, plants the message I need to take through the mangrove, the chapel, the drive-through pharmacy of my fare. Use all parts of yourself to carry you. Grandmother, I am afraid to be distant from you. I hold my head upright, a crown of thick black wires wound with pink hibiscus. There is this pain of imagining our island without you, pulsing at the end of each braid, this love, declaring you essential to me. I take all you've made of me into the ache of the world, your name, the one sure thing surviving.
Thank you. And it's beautiful. I'm going to share there was one a riddle that Duncan always used to say, which was, I was born before my grandmother. How could that be? And your description of that was just beautiful. And that traditional thing of the grandmother and the midwife, just an incredible bond. Thank you so much for tonight, Shivanee. It's just been an absolute pleasure to talk to you and to host you. If you would like to see more of Shivanee's work, I am going to put the links from the chat onto the YouTube channel where this goes up afterwards, and also onto my Facebook page. But you can also come and see her in concert on Thursday online at 8 p.m. British Summer Time for the Get a Word in Edgeways online concert. So Get a Word in Edgeways Festival site or my Facebook page for that. If you have enjoyed today, please do subscribe on YouTube and just go and explore Shivanee's work and her. She's on all sorts of social media, but the best place to really discover more about her would be on People Press and buy her book. Thank you very much for your company tonight, Shivanee, but all of you who have joined us, thank you for your ears and your thoughtful comments on the chat, and it's just been a delight to host you tonight.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's been a real I always get so much more, I think, than I give from sharings like this, and this is no exception. And to be welcomed so warmly by a traditional storyteller means so much to me. And the idea that I could embrace that tradition and be respectful of it and also tell my own stories is just, it's a real gift to do this kind of work alongside not just everyone in the Caribbean, but also alongside people like you. And I'm truly honored to do that and to be here with
Well, that goes both ways, and this Zoom window has been a gift. This window to the world. We have Janice from Chicago. We have Despina from Greece. We have people in Britain. It's just fantastic to be able to have this global space for us to come together and talk about things that we want to talk to about, things that are meaningful, things that are soul food. So thank you all. And we will be back next month on the first Tuesday of the month. And until now, then, good night, and go well wherever you are. And whether it is morning or afternoon or evening, go out and have a look up at the sky, because we all share the same sky.